to the non-fiction book, Flying Saucers from Outer Space, written by Major Donald Kehoe. Kehoe was a retired United States Marine who later became a writer. In late 1949, he was assigned a story on flying saucers for a magazine, and he later parlayed this into a best-selling book entitled The Flying Saucers Are Real, a serious look at unidentified flying objects. He followed this up in 1953 with Flying Saucers from Outer Space. My local public library owned this book, that exact one right there, and I can't even guess how many times I read this in my misspent youth. Kehoe's book is a nonfiction history of modern-day flying saucer sightings and the Air Force investigation, and has little or nothing to do with the script of Earth versus the Flying Saucers. One suspects the producers probably paid Kehoe a relatively small fee to give their project some respectability. A few months after the movie was released in 1956, Kehoe helped found, and he later headed, an organization called the National Investigations Committee on Aerial Phenomena, which the organization was based right here in Washington, D.C. for many years. Earth versus the Flying Saucers was produced by Sam Katzman, who was responsible for a lot of B-movies from the 30s through the 60s. The directors of Ray Harryhausen's movies weren't given a lot of latitude or weren't expected to do much artistically. As I mentioned earlier, Harryhausen thought his effects to be the most important part of the film. So they were responsible, the director was responsible for sort of filling in the gaps between the special effects with live action scenes that supported the effects and advanced the plot as it was. In this case, Earth versus the Flying Saucers was directed by a journeyman director named Fred F. Sears, who made 54 movies in less than 10 years. So that gives you an idea of how busy he was and how much care he put into it. Last week we discussed how War of the Worlds starred two relative unknowns, Gene Barry and Anne Robinson. Earth versus the Flying Saucers reunites us with Hugh Marlowe, who played the surly boyfriend in The Day the Earth Stood Still. Marlowe was a rather generic actor who appeared in a variety of films and television programs in the 50s and 60s before settling in for a long, long run on the television soap opera Another World. It's easy to confuse Marlowe with Richard Carlson, who also worked in science fiction movies of the era like Creature from the Black Lagoon and Kingdom of Outer Space, and who also had that semi-anonymous 1950s look, sort of non-draped or madman type of style. Joan Taylor, who plays Marlowe's wife in Earth versus the Flying Saucers, had a minor league acting career in the 50s and early 60s. In addition to Earth versus the Flying Saucers, she had what passed for the leading lady role in Ray Harryhausen's next film, 20 Million Miles to Earth. She later married a producer and retired from acting in the early 1960s. Earth versus the Flying Saucers was a B-movie, and although it did all right at the box office and was widely distributed around the world, as some of these posters show, it wasn't treated with the same critical respect The Day the Earth Stood Still and The War of the Worlds were given. However, mostly due to Harryhausen's special effects, Earth versus the Flying Saucers has gained a cult following. Unlike its two predecessors in this year's Summer Camp Film Festival, Earth versus the Flying Saucers hasn't been remade yet, but director Tim Burton paid tribute to the movie, especially Harryhausen's saucers, in his 1995 film Mars Attacks. The lower picture right there. Although Mars Attacks was officially inspired by a gory set of bubblegum collector's cards from the 60s, the debt that Mars Attacks owes Earth versus the Flying Saucers is very clear, and it's not meant to be hidden. It's something that Tim Burton intended to do. All right, it's almost time for tonight's film. However, despite many requests and the threat of a possible restraining order, I've once again written a theme song for a summer camp film. Yes, I've made it one of my life's goals to write theme songs for movies which sadly lacked them in their original release. This is what I call the Ballad of the Aliens from Earth versus the Flying Saucers, and it's actually, this year I did it in semi-karaoke style, so feel free to sing along if you wish. Good news is tonight's movie is about to begin. Bad news is that there'll be no more summer camp films until next summer. Once again, thanks to the Hirshhorn Museum Sculpture Garden for doing this. I hope to see you all back next summer and enjoy the movie.